Power is an illusion that shatters the moment someone walks into your war room with your own eyes staring back at you. Dekyung Dae learned that lesson during a high-stakes negotiation in Denver, when a 5-year-old boy in a perfectly tailored suit walked into his secret meeting, looked at him with eyes that were unmistakably his own, and said with absolute certainty, "You're my father. My mom said you needed to know." The meeting had been scheduled for weeks. Territorial negotiations with the Bratva, the Russian organized crime syndicate operating throughout Colorado. Dekyung ran Korean operations in the Mountain West, controlled gambling, import-export operations, and legitimate businesses that laundered money throughout Denver and surrounding states. The Russians wanted expansion into territories Dekyung controlled. He wanted assurances they'd respect boundaries and operational protocols. The negotiation was delicate, high stakes, the kind of meeting where any perceived weakness could shift power dynamics catastrophically. The meeting was being held in a private room at one of Dekyung's legitimate businesses, a high-end restaurant in downtown Denver that closed to the public for private events when he needed secure locations for syndicate business. Present were Dekyung and his 3 top lieutenants, DMITRI Volkov and his 4 senior Bratva members, and enough security on both sides that the room felt like armed standoff barely contained by diplomatic protocol. They'd been negotiating for 90 minutes. Making progress on territory divisions, discussing revenue sharing for operations that would overlap their respective areas, establishing protocols for dispute resolution. Dekyung was in complete control. His preferred state during negotiations. He'd prepared thoroughly, knew his positions and his acceptable compromises, was guiding the conversation toward outcomes favorable to his organization while giving the Russians enough that they'd accept the agreement. Then the door opened. Security should have prevented any interruptions. The meeting was private, the location was secured, no one should have been able to access the room without clearance from both organizations. But someone had bypassed security. A woman, Latina, late 20s, professional attire, carrying herself with confidence that suggested she understood exactly how inappropriate her presence was but had decided the intrusion was necessary anyway. And holding her hand was a small boy, maybe 5 years old, wearing a child-sized suit that was clearly custom-made, his dark hair neatly styled, his posture straight and confident. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said, addressing Dekyung directly despite the armed men between them. "But this couldn't wait. Your son needed to meet you." The room went absolutely silent. Every guard reached for weapons. Dekyung's Lieutenant Min Jae moved to intercept the woman and child. DMITRI Volkov watched with obvious interest in how this disruption would affect negotiations. But Dekyung just stared at the boy. Because the child was looking at him with eyes that were unmistakably his own. Not just similar, identical. The same unusual pale gray color, the same intense focus, the same cold assessment that Dekyung saw when he looked in mirrors. The boy wasn't afraid despite the armed men and the obvious tension. He was studying Dekyung the same way Dekyung studied opponents during negotiations, evaluating, calculating, determining what approach would be most effective. "Min Jae, don't," Dekyung said quietly, stopping his lieutenant from removing the woman and child. "Let them approach." The woman walked forward, the boy keeping pace beside her, both of them showing no fear despite walking into a room full of armed criminals from 2 different organizations. When they reached Dekyung's position at the negotiating table, the boy let go of his mother's hand and walked the final steps alone. He stopped directly in front of Dekyung, looking up at him with those identical eyes. "You're my father," the boy said. Not a question, a statement delivered with absolute certainty. "My mom said you didn't know about me. But I'm 5 now and she said it was time you knew you had a son." Dekyung had never been at a loss for words during business negotiations. He'd faced threats, violence, complex diplomatic situations requiring careful verbal navigation. He'd always maintained control, always known exactly what to say to achieve desired outcomes. But he had absolutely no idea how to respond to a 5-year-old claiming to be his son in the middle of a high-stakes territorial negotiation with the Russian Bratva. "What's your name?" he managed to ask. "Mateo. Mateo Gonzalez. But Mom says my real last name should be Day because you're my father even though you didn't know about me." Dekyung looked at the woman. "Charisse Gonzalez, based on the child's introduction." She met his gaze without flinching, clearly prepared for whatever his response would be. "We need to discuss this privately," Dekyung said. "This is not appropriate venue." "I know this isn't appropriate," Charisse interrupted. "I've been trying to contact you for 6 months. Your people screen all your communications. I couldn't get a message through normal channels. So I found out where you'd be today and I brought Mateo directly to you because this conversation needs to happen." "You interrupted a business meeting." "I interrupted a meeting between criminals. I'm not impressed by the armed men or the territorial negotiations or whatever you were discussing. My son deserves to know his father. Your son deserves to have his father know he exists. That's more important than your business." DMITRI Volkov laughed. Sharp, amused sound that broke the tension slightly. "She has courage, walking into this room. And the boy, he looks exactly like you, Day. Same eyes, same way of staring like he's calculating how to kill you. This is your son." Dekyung looked back at Mateo. The resemblance was undeniable. Not just the eyes, the bone structure, the way he held himself, the intensity of his focus. This was his child. He knew it with certainty that bypassed any need for DNA testing or verification. But acknowledging paternity in this room, in front of the Russians during delicate negotiations, created complications he hadn't prepared for. "We'll continue this negotiation tomorrow," Dekyung said to Dmitri. "Obviously circumstances have changed and we both need time to process this development." "Obviously," Dmitri agreed, still looking amused. "Though I think the negotiation just became more interesting. You have a son now. That's weakness we didn't know existed. Changes the dynamics considerably. It changes nothing about our business relationship. It changes everything. You have vulnerability now. Something we can leverage if negotiations don't go favorably. The boy is beautiful bargaining chip you just had delivered to our attention." Dekyung felt cold fury rising. "If you or your organization make any move toward my son, our negotiations end and this becomes war. Touch the child and I'll eliminate your entire operation in Colorado." There it is, the weakness. You'll start a war to protect a child you learned about 5 minutes ago. That's valuable information about your priorities. "Dmitri, we're done for today. Leave. Now." The Russians left, clearly satisfied that they'd gained strategic advantage through the unexpected revelation of Dekyung's previously unknown son. Once they were gone, Dekyung turned his full attention to Charisse and Mateo. "You need to leave Denver immediately. The Russians know about Mateo now. They'll use him as leverage if I don't give them favorable terms in our negotiations. You've put him in danger by bringing him here." "I put him in danger?" Charisse's voice was sharp with anger. "You put him in danger by being a crime boss who makes enemies who would target children. I brought him here because he deserves to know his father. If that creates complications for your criminal business, that's your problem to solve." "How do you know I'm his father?" "We'd need DNA testing. Look at him. He has your eyes, your face, your entire demeanor. You know he's yours just like I've known since the moment he was born. We don't need DNA testing to confirm what's obvious." "When did we? How did this happen?" 6 years ago. We met at a charity gala in Denver. You were there representing your import-export business. I was there working as event coordinator. We talked, had chemistry, spent one night together. You left the next morning and I never heard from you again despite trying to contact you when I discovered I was pregnant." Dekyung vaguely remembered the night she described. A charity event where he'd been performing his role as legitimate businessman, had met an attractive event coordinator, had allowed himself one night of normal human connection before returning to his carefully controlled life. He hadn't known she'd tried to contact him. His security screened all communications. Anyone he hadn't explicitly approved for contact wouldn't get messages through to him. "I didn't know you were pregnant. I didn't know about him." "I believe you. But he exists regardless of whether you knew. And he deserves to have a father who acknowledges him instead of just being the crime boss who unknowingly has a son." "What do you want? Money? Child support?" "I can provide financial." "I don't want your money. I want you to be his father. To know him, to be present in his life, to give him the relationship he deserves instead of just paying to make the complication go away. That's not possible. My life is dangerous, you saw that today. Being connected to me makes Matteo a target. The best thing I can do for him is stay away while ensuring you both have financial resources and protection. Matteo, who'd been quietly listening to the adults argue, spoke up, I don't want you to stay away. I want you to be my dad. Mom showed me pictures. I know what you look like. I know you're important and busy. But I'm your son and I want you to know me. Dekyung looked at the child, his child, standing there with absolute confidence despite having just walked into a room full of armed criminals, having just claimed his father in front of people who'd immediately seen him as leverage. You're very brave, Dekyung said. Walking in here like you did. Most children would be terrified. Mom said you're not scary. She said you're just busy and that you didn't know about me but that you'd want to know once you found out. So I wasn't scared. You're my dad. The simple certainty in Matteo's voice was devastating. This child had walked into a dangerous situation with complete confidence that his father would be happy to know he existed. Dekyung didn't know how to be a father. He'd spent 20 years building a criminal empire, had deliberately avoided relationships and commitments that would create vulnerabilities, had structured his entire life around maintaining control and eliminating weaknesses. But this child existed regardless of whether Dekyung was prepared for fatherhood. And the Russians now knew about him, which meant Matteo was already in danger whether Dekyung acknowledged him or not. You need protection, Dekyung said to Charisse. Both of you. The Russians will investigate, will confirm Matteo is my son, will consider using him as leverage. I need to move you somewhere secure until I've resolved the situation. I'm not going into hiding because your business associates are threatening. They're not associates, they're rivals who just discovered a weakness they can exploit. If you want Matteo safe, you'll accept my protection until I've established that targeting him results in war no one wants. And after that? After you've made your threats and established your boundaries? Do you stay in his life or do you just provide security from a distance? Dekyung looked at Matteo, who was watching him with those identical gray eyes, waiting to see what his father would decide. I don't know. I've never been a father. I don't know how to be present in his life without making him more of a target than he already is just from existing. Then you figure it out. Because he's your son whether you know how to be a father or not. And he deserves better than a father who stays away because it's easier than learning how to be present. Dekyung made a decision that would change everything about his carefully controlled life. You're right. He deserves better. I'll figure it out. But first, we establish security. Then I can learn how to be his father. He called Minjae over. We need secure location for Ms. Gonzalez and Matteo. Full security detail, discreet surveillance, protection protocols for high-value targets. Implement immediately. Sir, are you confirming the child is yours? I'm confirming that he's under my protection and that anyone who targets him is declaring war. Make that clear to all our people and to anyone who asks. Understood. I'll arrange secure location immediately. Dekyung looked at Matteo one more time. I'm going to make sure you're safe. Then I'm going to learn how to be your father. That's a promise. Matteo smiled, the first genuine child smile Dekyung had seen from him. Okay. I knew you'd want to be my dad once you knew about me. The absolute confidence of that statement made Dekyung realize that this 5-year-old had more faith in his father's capacity for love than Dekyung had in himself. He was about to find out whether that faith was justified or whether his son had just walked into his life at exactly the wrong moment, creating vulnerability that would destroy everything Dekyung had built over 20 years. Subscribe to see what happens when a cold crime boss discovers he has a son during a high-stakes negotiation, and a 5-year-old's absolute certainty about family forces transformation of someone who thought control meant never having weaknesses. Comment where you're watching from, and tell me, would you want a father who was a crime boss if it meant danger came with the relationship? This story is just beginning. Dekyung moved Charisse and Matteo to a secure property that same evening, a penthouse in downtown Denver that was owned through shell companies, professionally secured with cameras and monitoring systems, staffed with round-the-clock security detail. This is excessive, Charisse said, looking at the armed guards positioned throughout the building. We don't need this level of protection. You do. The moment Matteo walked into that meeting, he became leverage against me in territorial negotiations. The Russians will investigate whether he's actually my son. Once confirmed, they'll calculate whether using him as bargaining chip is worth the risk of war. This security ensures that calculation doesn't favor making moves against him. For how long? Are we supposed to live like prisoners in a gilded cage while you conduct criminal business? Until I've established clear consequences for targeting my family. Once that's established, we can discuss less intrusive security arrangements. Your family? You just met Matteo 2 hours ago and you're claiming us as family? He's my son. That makes him family regardless of how long I've known about his existence. And you're his mother, which means you're also under my protection whether you want it or not. Matteo was exploring the penthouse with obvious delight. The space was enormous compared to the modest apartment where he'd lived with Charisse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Denver's skyline, the furnishings were expensive, the technology was cutting edge. This place is amazing, he called from the living room. Can I really live here? Temporarily, Dekyung said. Until we've established that you're safe. Because people want to hurt me because you're my dad? The direct question deserved direct answer. Yes. Because I have rivals who might think hurting you would give them advantage over me. We're making sure that doesn't happen. Will you hurt them if they try? Yes. Matteo processed that answer with concerning ease for a 5-year-old. Okay. Mom says violence is wrong but that sometimes people have to protect their families. Is that what you're doing? That's exactly what I'm doing. Then it's okay. I understand. Charisse pulled Dekyung aside while Matteo continued exploring. Don't normalize violence for him. He's 5 years old. He shouldn't be comfortable with conversations about hurting people who threaten us. He walked into a meeting of armed criminals with complete confidence. He's already more comfortable with this world than you'd like him to be. I'm just being honest about the realities instead of pretending threats don't exist. The realities exist because you're a crime boss. If you were a legitimate businessman like I thought you were when we met, we wouldn't need armed guards and secure properties. If I was a legitimate businessman, I'd have no resources to protect you from threats that exist regardless. My profession creates dangers but it also gives me tools to address those dangers. Right now, those tools are keeping our son safe. Our son. You keep saying that like you've accepted it immediately. I have accepted it. He has my eyes, my face, my intensity. I knew he was mine the moment I looked at him. DNA testing can confirm it but I don't need confirmation to know he's my child. What does that mean practically? You provide security and money but stay emotionally distant? You learn how to be a father? You try to build actual relationship with him? I don't know yet. I've never had relationships that mattered more than operational effectiveness. I've structured my life around control and eliminating vulnerabilities. Matteo is vulnerability I can't eliminate because he exists whether I'm prepared for fatherhood or not. That's a terrible way to think about your son, as vulnerability you can't eliminate. It's an honest way to think about the reality. He's my son, which means I'll protect him with everything I have. But he's also a weakness that rivals can exploit. Both things are true simultaneously. Over the next week, Dekyung established the security perimeter he needed while also trying to figure out how to actually interact with the child who was unmistakably his. He visited the penthouse daily, ostensibly to check security but actually to see Matteo. The child was fascinated by his father, asked constant questions about Dekyung's work. Charisse intercepted most of these before Dekyung could answer with inappropriate honesty, showed obvious desire for relationship beyond just protection. What do you do? Matteo asked during one visit. For work? Dekyung looked at Charisse, who shook her head sharply. Clearly she didn't want honest explanation of organized crime operations. I run import-export businesses. We bring products from Korea and distribute them throughout the western United States. Is it dangerous? Because you have guards and security and people who protect you. It can be dangerous. There are people who want what I have or who disagree with how I run my businesses. The security ensures I'm safe while I work. Will I work with you when I'm older? Because I'm your son? The question created uncomfortable silence. Young had never considered succession, had never thought about legacy beyond just maintaining power. But Matteo was his son, his heir, technically, if Young wanted to establish that relationship. That's a decision you'll make when you're older. Right now, you focus on being 5 and learning everything you can. Mom says I'm smart. She says I learn fast and I understand things quickly. I can see that. You walked into a very dangerous situation with complete confidence. That shows intelligence and courage. I wasn't scared because you're my dad. I knew you wouldn't let anyone hurt me. The absolute trust in that statement was both heartwarming and terrifying. Matteo had faith that Young would protect him based purely on biological relationship they'd confirmed hours earlier. That was enormous responsibility for someone who'd never had to protect anything beyond his organization's interests. 2 weeks after Matteo's dramatic introduction, Young received message from DMITRI Volkov requesting meeting to continue territorial negotiations. They've confirmed Matteo is your son, Minjay reported. They've investigated, verified the timeline of your relationship with Charisse, confirmed the child's existence. They know this is real vulnerability. What are they asking for in the negotiations? Substantial territorial concessions. They want access to operations we previously refused to share, they want revenue splits that favor them significantly. They're leveraging Matteo's existence to demand terms we'd never otherwise accept. Scheduled a meeting. I'll handle the negotiations. Sir, if you don't give them favorable terms, they might move against Matteo. If they move against Matteo, I'll eliminate their entire organization. Make sure they understand that calculation before the meeting. The meeting was scheduled for the same location as the previous interrupted negotiation. This time, security was even tighter, both sides understanding that the stakes had increased significantly. Young arrived with Minjay and his security detail. Dimitri was already there with his senior Bratva members. Your son is impressive, Dimitri said as opening statement. Walking into our previous meeting with such confidence. He has your eyes, your intensity. Definitely your child. We're not here to discuss my son. We're here to finalize territorial agreements. But your son is relevant to those agreements. You have vulnerability now that you didn't have before. That vulnerability changes what terms you can demand versus what terms you must accept. My son is not part of business negotiations. Everything is part of business negotiations. You know this. Personal life, family, weaknesses, all of it factors into what leverage each side has. You've always understood that. Now you're on the disadvantaged side because we know you have something you'll protect at any cost. What are your terms? Dimitri outlined demands that were significantly more favorable to the Bratva than anything Young would normally accept: major territorial concessions, revenue sharing that gave Russians disproportionate benefits, access to operations Young's organization had exclusively controlled. Those terms are unacceptable, Young said flatly. Then we'll need to reconsider our approach to negotiations. Perhaps more direct incentives for your cooperation. If you're threatening my son, be clear about it. Don't imply through diplomatic language. I'm not threatening anything. I'm observing that you have new priorities that might influence your decision-making. Whether those priorities lead to more flexible negotiating position is up to you. Young stood. This negotiation is over. You want my territory and my operations. You thought discovering I have a son would give you leverage to take what you couldn't earn through legitimate competition. You were wrong. We weren't wrong. You're just willing to risk your son to maintain position. I'm not risking my son. I'm ensuring he grows up knowing his father doesn't surrender to threats. You don't get favorable terms because you've identified weakness. You get war if you try to exploit that weakness. Choose carefully which outcome you prefer. He left the meeting, returned to the penthouse where Charisse and Matteo were waiting. How did negotiations go? Charisse asked. They're trying to use Matteo as leverage. demanding territorial concessions I'd never accept under normal circumstances. Implying they'll move against him if I don't give them favorable terms. What did you tell them? That attempting to use my son as leverage results in war. That I'm not surrendering position because they've identified vulnerability. So you're risking his safety to maintain criminal power? I'm establishing that his safety isn't negotiable currency. If I give them concessions because they threatened him, it establishes pattern. Anyone who wants concessions just threatens my family. That makes Matteo perpetually vulnerable. Better to establish immediately that threatening him results in catastrophic consequences rather than successful negotiations. You're using game theory to protect our son. I'm using strategic thinking to ensure our son doesn't become bargaining chip every time I face business conflicts. It's the right approach even if the reasoning sounds cold. Matteo was listening from the other room. He walked over to Duck Young. Are the bad people going to hurt me because I'm your son? Duck Young knelt down to be at Matteo's eye level. Some people might try. But I'm making sure they understand that trying means they get hurt much worse than they could ever hurt you. That's how protection works, make the consequences of attacking you so severe that no one chooses to try. Will you kill them if they try to hurt me? The direct question deserved direct answer. Yes. If someone tries to hurt you, I'll eliminate the threat completely. That's what fathers do, protect their children from anyone who wants to harm them. Okay. I'm not scared then. The complete trust in Duck Young's ability to protect him was simultaneously heartening and devastating. Heartening because his son believed in him, devastating because that belief was based on Duck Young's willingness to commit violence. 3 weeks after Matteo's introduction, the Bratva made their move. It wasn't direct attack, they were smart enough to know that would trigger the war Duck Young had promised. Instead, they created indirect pressure designed to force Duck Young into accepting their negotiating terms. They moved against his operations. Raided gambling locations, disrupted import shipments, applied pressure to his revenue streams in ways that created immediate financial impacts. They're trying to force you into accepting their terms through economic pressure, Minjay reported. Every day this continues, we lose significant revenue. Eventually the pressure will be unsustainable and you'll have to choose between accepting their demands or going to war. How long before the pressure becomes unsustainable? Months, maybe. We have reserves that can carry us through sustained disruption. But eventually we'll need to either capitulate or escalate to open conflict. What are our options for escalation that don't put Matteo at risk? There are no options that eliminate risk to him. He's your known vulnerability. Any escalation creates risk that they'll move directly against him rather than just applying economic pressure. Duck Young was facing impossible choice. Accept terms that would weaken his organization significantly, or escalate to war that could put Matteo in direct danger. The situation came to a head when Charisse demanded meeting about Matteo's future. This can't continue, she said when Duck Young arrived at the penthouse. We've been living in this secure facility for a month. Matteo can't go to school, can't see his friends, can't have normal life. I appreciate the protection, but this isn't sustainable long term. The threats are real. The threats exist because you're in a business that creates enemies. If you weren't a crime boss, Matteo could live normal life instead of being trapped in a luxury prison because your rivals want leverage. What are you suggesting? That I leave organized crime so Matteo can have normal childhood? I'm suggesting you make a choice about what matters more, your criminal empire or your son's well-being. Because right now you're trying to maintain both and it's creating a situation where he's neither safe nor free. Leaving organized crime isn't simple. It takes years of transition. Then start the transition. Make the choice to become someone whose son isn't perpetually in danger because of his father's profession. What if the transition creates more danger than maintaining current position? Organizations don't let people leave cleanly. Extracting myself could trigger conflicts worse than what we're facing now. Then we leave. Matteo and I move somewhere you're not known, somewhere we can have normal life without security details and territorial conflicts. You'd take my son away? I'd protect my son the way I've been protecting him for 5 years while you didn't know he existed. If the only way to give him safe childhood is to remove him from your world, that's what I'll do. Duck Young realized he was facing the real choice, maintain his position and risk losing Mateo to Charissa's protective instincts, or transition out of organized crime to keep his son in his life. "Don't take him away," he said quietly. "Give me time to figure out how to extract myself from this business without creating worse danger. I'll find a way to become someone whose son can have normal life." "How much time?" "I don't know. Months, maybe a year. But I'll start the process. I'll become someone different so Mateo can have the father and the life he deserves." "Why? You've spent 20 years building this empire. Why give it up for a son you just met?" "Because he walked into my meeting with complete confidence that I'd want to be his father. Because he has my eyes and my intensity, and he deserves better than a father who's too committed to criminal power to be present in his life. Because losing my organization is survivable but losing my son isn't." Charisse studied him carefully. "You're serious? You're actually willing to leave organized crime for him?" "I'm serious. I don't know how to do it without creating catastrophic consequences. But I'll figure it out because the alternative is losing Mateo to your protective relocation plan." "What about the Russians? What about the territorial conflicts and the economic pressure?" "I'll handle it. Give me time to manage the transition properly and I'll handle all of it." Over the next 6 months, Duck Young executed the most complex negotiation of his career, not with the Russians, but with his own organization about succession and transition. He couldn't just walk away. 20 years of built relationships, obligations, and power structures meant his departure needed to be managed carefully to avoid creating violence worse than his continued involvement. He started identifying successors within his organization. People who could take over operations without triggering internal conflicts or external challenges from rivals. He began systematically transferring operations to trusted lieutenants, giving them increasing autonomy and authority while maintaining oversight to ensure transitions didn't create instability. He built legitimate businesses that could employ his people without criminal operations, creating pathways for organization members to transition to legal work if they chose. All while maintaining enough presence and power to prevent the Bratva from seeing his transition as weakness they could exploit. "You're really doing this," Minjay observed during one of their planning sessions. "Dismantling everything you built for a child you didn't know existed 6 months ago. I'm restructuring my life so my son doesn't grow up with a father who's perpetually in conflict with people who'd use him as leverage. That's worth more than maintaining criminal empire." "What if the transition fails? What if pulling back creates power vacuum that leads to violence worse than what we're currently managing?" "Then I'll handle that too. But I'm not risking Mateo's childhood to maintain position I built before I knew I was a father." The Russians noticed Duck Young's gradual withdrawal. They saw operations being transferred, power being delegated, Duck Young's direct involvement declining. Dmitri requested meeting. "You're leaving." "Not immediately, but you're extracting yourself from operations." "This is because of the boy. This is because I'm transitioning to legitimate business focus. What I do with my organization is not your concern. It's absolutely our concern when the person we've been negotiating with is planning departure. Who takes over your territory? Who becomes our negotiating partner? These are relevant questions. Minjay will take over operations. He has my complete confidence and my authority. Whatever agreements we reach, he'll implement and maintain." "And you? You become legitimate businessman to give your son normal life?" "I become whatever I need to be to ensure my son grows up safe and with present father." "That's not weakness, it's priority shift." "It's weakness. You're surrendering power because a child you just met walked into a meeting and made you reconsider everything. That's exactly the leverage we were looking for. You were looking for leverage to improve negotiating position. What you found is that I'll restructure my entire life to protect my son. That's not weakness you can exploit, it's motivation that makes me more dangerous to anyone who threatens him." "How do you figure?" "Because before Mateo, I operated according to business logic, calculated risks, strategic decisions, cost-benefit analysis. Now I operate according to parental logic, absolute protection of my child regardless of cost. That makes me less predictable and more willing to accept catastrophic consequences to eliminate threats." That's not advantageous dynamic for anyone considering moves against my family. DMITRI processed that logic. You're saying discovering you have a son makes you more dangerous, not less. I'm saying it changes my decision calculus in ways that make threatening him much riskier than you initially assumed. Take that into account as we finalize territorial agreements. They reached agreement that night, territorial divisions that were fair rather than exploitative, revenue sharing that reflected actual operational contributions rather than leverage-based concessions, protocols for dispute resolution that didn't involve threatening families. You could have gotten these terms without restructuring your life, DMITRI observed as they finalized the agreement. I could have. But restructuring my life gives me something more valuable than favorable business terms. Time with my son while he's young enough to want relationship with me. That's worth more than maintaining criminal empire. 1 year after Matteo walked into Dekyung's meeting, the transition was largely complete. Dekyung had successfully extracted himself from day-to-day criminal operations. Min-jae ran the organization with Dekyung's guidance but without his direct involvement. The transition had been managed carefully enough to avoid creating violence or instability. Dekyung's life was now primarily focused on legitimate businesses and on learning how to be Matteo's father. You did it, Charisse said during dinner at the penthouse, which was now their actual home rather than just secure location. You actually left organized crime so you could be present in Matteo's life. I'm not completely extracted. I still have influence over the organization, I'm still involved in strategic decisions. But I'm not running criminal operations daily. That's enough separation that Matteo can have more normal life. How does it feel? Giving up 20 years of built power? Strange. I defined myself through that power for so long that walking away feels like abandoning identity. But watching Matteo grow up, being present for his childhood, teaching him things, that's creating new identity that's more meaningful than criminal power ever was. Matteo came running into the dining room, excited about something he'd built with blocks. Dad, look what I made. It's a building like the ones you own. Dekyung looked at the block structure, impressive for a 6-year-old, showing spatial reasoning and design sense. That's excellent work. You're very talented at building things. When I'm older, can I work with you? Building real buildings instead of block ones? Absolutely. When you're older, we'll build things together. Real buildings, real businesses, real success that doesn't require the work I used to do. What work did you used to do? Dekyung looked at Charisse, who nodded, giving permission to be honest in age-appropriate way. I used to run businesses that weren't always legal. Businesses that created conflicts with other people and that made my life dangerous. I don't do that work anymore because I decided being your father was more important than maintaining that kind of power. Because you love me? Because I love you. And because you walked into my meeting with complete confidence that I'd want to be your dad, and I realized that confidence was more valuable than anything I'd built over 20 years. I knew you'd want to be my dad, Matteo said with absolute certainty. You just needed to know I existed. 5 years after Matteo's introduction, Dekyung had built completely different life. He ran successful legitimate businesses, had maintained enough influence over his former organization to ensure stability without being involved in criminal operations, had become the present father he'd never imagined being when Matteo first walked into that meeting. Do you regret it? Charisse asked one evening. They'd been married for 2 years, relationship that had developed from co-parenting into genuine partnership. Giving up everything you built to become a father? Never. What I had before was power without meaning. What I have now is smaller in scope but infinitely more valuable. Matteo is 10 now, I've been present for half his life. If I'd stayed in my old life, I'd have missed all of it. He adores you. He tells people his dad used to be important and powerful but chose to be just his dad instead. He's proud of that choice. I'm proud of that choice too. Not because leaving was noble, it was necessary to keep him safe and give him normal childhood. But because it resulted in relationship with him that's more meaningful than any power I accumulated. 10-year-old Matteo was everything Dekyung had seen in him at 5. Intelligent, confident, intense in his focus, showing leadership qualities that suggested he'd be formidable as an adult. But he was also gentle, kind, well-adjusted in ways that wouldn't have been possible if Dekyung had stayed in criminal operations. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Mateo said one evening. "Always. Do you miss it? Being important and having people follow your orders and being powerful?" Dekyung considered the question carefully. "Sometimes I miss the feeling of control, of knowing I could solve problems through power and resources. But I don't miss the life itself. I don't miss the conflicts, the danger, the need to maintain control at all costs. Being your father is better than any of that. Even though you had to give up everything to do it? I didn't give up everything. I gave up power that was built on activities that created harm. What I got in return was relationship with you and the chance to build different life that creates value instead of just maintaining control. That's not sacrifice, it's upgrade. When I'm older, can I learn about what you used to do? Not to do it myself, but just to understand? When you're older, I'll tell you everything. The good decisions and the terrible ones, the power I built and the harm it caused, the reasons I left and what that transition required. You deserve to know the full truth about who I was and who I became." "Okay. But I already know the most important thing, you chose me over everything else. That's what matters." That simple summary from a 10-year-old captured the truth. Dekyung had chosen fatherhood over power, had restructured his entire life because a 5-year-old walked into his meeting with absolute certainty that his father would want to know him. That choice had been the most significant of Dekyung's life. More important than any territorial negotiation, more transformative than 20 years of building criminal empire, more meaningful than any power he'd accumulated. The boy with his exact eyes who'd walked into his war room claiming his father had been right, Dekyung did want to know him. Wanted it enough to give up everything he'd built to become the father that confident 5-year-old had believed existed. Power is an illusion that shatters when someone you didn't know existed walks into your life and forces you to choose between control and love. Dekyung Dae had spent 20 years building criminal empire based on control, strategy, and elimination of weakness. Then a 5-year-old boy walked into his high-stakes negotiation with eyes that were unmistakably his own, announced he was his son, and shattered every assumption Dekyung had made about what mattered. Mateo's introduction created immediate vulnerability. Rivals instantly recognized that Dekyung had weakness they could exploit, that the cold crime boss had someone he'd protect regardless of cost. That vulnerability could have destroyed everything Dekyung built. Instead, it transformed who he was. Because Mateo didn't walk into that meeting afraid or uncertain. He walked in with absolute confidence that his father would want to know him. That biological relationship created bond that transcended Dekyung's carefully controlled life. That confidence was both gift and challenge. Gift because it showed Dekyung what unconditional love looked like. Challenge because it demanded he become someone worthy of that confidence, someone who'd choose fatherhood over power when the two came into conflict. Their story proves that some vulnerabilities are worth accepting. Dekyung's rivals were right that Mateo was weakness they could exploit. But they were wrong about what that weakness meant for Dekyung's decision-making. Instead of making him more compliant to avoid threats against his son, it made him more determined to eliminate the conditions that created those threats. He couldn't eliminate rivals through violence without escalating danger to Mateo. So he eliminated the source of vulnerability by leaving the life that made his son a target. It also proves that transformation is possible even from positions of extreme power. Dekyung could have chosen to maintain his empire, to protect Mateo through overwhelming force and strategic ruthlessness. Instead, he chose to become someone different, someone whose son could have normal childhood instead of living as leverage in criminal conflicts. That transformation wasn't easy or simple. It required years of careful transition, strategic succession planning, building legitimate alternatives to criminal operations. But it was necessary to give Mateo the father he deserved, present, available, not perpetually in conflict with people who'd use a child as bargaining chip. Most importantly, their story demonstrates that sometimes the most powerful choice is surrendering power. Dekyung was at peak of his influence when Mateo walked into his life. Maintaining that influence meant maintaining everything that made Mateo vulnerable. Surrendering it meant building different relationship with his son, one based on presence rather than just protection, on genuine fatherhood rather than just financial provision. The 5-year-old who walked into a war room with his father's exact eyes, claiming his place with absolute certainty. The crime boss who realized that power built over 20 years was worth less than relationship with the son he'd just discovered existed. Both of them proving that the strongest bonds are forged when someone loves you enough to become a completely different person than who they were before you arrived. If you loved this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about unexpected fatherhood transforming ruthless men, children's absolute confidence forcing transformation, and power being surrendered for something infinitely more valuable. Comment below, would you give up 20 years of built power for a child you just discovered existed? Or would you try to maintain both worlds despite the danger? Share your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and remember, the most powerful transformation happens when someone walks into your carefully controlled life and forces you to choose between maintaining power and becoming someone worthy of their unconditional love. Sometimes the strongest choice is surrendering everything you built to become the person they already believe you are. Until next time.